The next group that we're going to hear from is Vermonters for a Clean Environment. And so I'll turn it over to Annette Smith, I guess, to start.
Thank you.
But I would like to know at the outset, has anybody ceded any time to you?
Yes,
Okay.
Sally Colopy
Yeah?
Yes, I'd like to cede my 15 minutes, please.
Okay.
has ceded her time.
Okay, great.
My name is Annette Smith. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment. Primarily, the experts you've heard from so far have had, as Mr. Ashtiani just said, the intention to show compliance. Our intention is to protect public health and the quality of life for Vermonters. The board has several open dockets with noise complaints from Sheffield, Georgia Mountain, and the violation for Lowell is still producing documents. Vermonters for a Clean Environment has documented complaints from people 2.5 miles from all 3 projects and more than 5 miles from the Lowell Wind project. We have firsthand experience with Vermonters who have health issues involving headache, nausea, cardiac issues. We've had homes abandoned. We have had people who have sold their homes at a loss because of the health effects. And so our approach is that 45 is too high. Neighbors who have monitors have said 40 is really loud. And so we disagree with the proposals that you've heard so far, 45 dBA as being protective. And we are pleased to present for us Stephen Ambrose, a noise control expert with 30 years of experience in the field, power plant noise control, and who has experienced what it's like living in a home next to wind turbines. And because of his issues, he's going to be sitting for this presentation. And so I thank you very much for hearing from him.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I appreciate this opportunity.
You're on.
It's working.
Yes.
I'm gravity limited, as you can see. It comes with my age and years of experience. The first slide I'll go to is, first slide is me. I'm Stephen Ambrose, ASA, INSEE board certified. I have my own company. Yet I started in 1976 when the local practice was listen first, then sound measurements. In other words, know what you're measuring. I worked with LG Copley Associates, then Stone & Webster, Shaw Group, all companies, including my own now, the design goal, require clients to be good acoustic neighbors, know why neighbors complain, and hold paramount public health, safety, and well-being. My practice today, listen first, then sound measurements. It's easy. Oops, slide. So my presentation is going to be quite a bit different than others. I have a sense of humor. I thoroughly enjoy what I do. Noise, from a listener's perspective, is very easy. You know what you like, and you know what you don't. Next slide. So, conversation starts with me asking the question, why are neighbors complaining? And I have an assistant. Next slide. That's it. Next slide. Okay, this is evidence. Shirley Wind out in Wisconsin, and went through the courts, and as you can read, residents testified adverse health effects, forcing home abandonment. And during a cooperative survey put on by Brown County, George Hessler, another INSEE member, noted that when a family came back with their baby, it started crying shortly after entering the home that the parents had abandoned earlier. That's a pretty good detector right there. You can't say he's biased. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just okay. Paul Schomer was also involved with that measurement or that survey, and he interviewed along with 4 others. Residents of the nearest house reported that their baby son, 2 years old, woke up 4 times a night screaming. He now sleeps normally, away from, next slide. Okay, now I'm asking the question, why? Too loud. Next. Fix. Next. Must minimize adverse human responses. That's what we have failed to do. How? Lower dBA limit. Use published studies and standards. Next slide. Make compliance easy to assess and measure. Long-term average. Next. No, average is high. Next slide. That's a wind turbine. Real measurements. Neighbors hear those peaks up at the top of the red line. 43 to 46 dBA. Average, the experts will average 38. And that is, those measurements are sampled 8 times a second. So you get to see all the variations that occur that people hear. Next slide. People react to changes in sound levels, the frequency content, pure tones, infrasound, and pressure impulses. The latter two we have to learn a lot more about. Next slide. Now I'm going to go back. Vermont's Act 250, next slide. It was used by 2 boards. Next slide. Pointed out that listening is important. They ended up in the hearing saying people hear instantaneous peak variations above background and respond accordingly. Next slide. They ruled L max more appropriate than LEQ. Next slide. When a sound source is variable, and especially when higher than normal, the higher levels affect people. L max, the proper protective standard. That's why we're in this difficulty. LA max minus L90 must be less than 10 dB on that. And so this represents turbines on, L90, turbines off. Okay, go ahead next. And here we go again, the same slide. And it shows, when I compare what the background sound level was, this was at Falmouth, Massachusetts, Wind 1 operating. The ambient background was actually 28 dBA. Next slide. Background ambient, next slide. Here are 2 standards. Note the date, 1971. Predates a lot of research done by the wind turbine advocates. Next slide. Here's what they say in the ISO. For rural areas, expect daytime levels 35, evening 30, 25 nighttime. 25 nighttime. Next slide. That's Vermont. 25. Well, less than 25, actually. Next slide. Here's ANSI 12.9 Part 4. Quiet rural area with new, unfamiliar intrusive noise source. Outdoors, night average should not exceed 30 dBA for compatibility, or 35 for marginal compatibility. That's important. Go. Next slide. Part 4. A new one can produce annoyance equivalent to 15 dB increase above measured or predicted. This is why we're having this meeting. We're here because of failure. Next slide. This goes back to the US EPA. And I remember when the first release of the 73 and the 74. And they end up stating annoyance 15 dB. Go ahead, next slide. Wind masking. Next. No, wind does not mask. We cannot use wind or faux wind or wind on microphone. That just detracts. We really do not fully understand how much different the human ear senses wind, noise, than a microphone. Now, the ear canal is long and narrow and is terminated with a diaphragm. A microphone sits on top of a cylinder, directly exposed. It does not have the protection that the ear canal. My sense is this faux noise, this wind on microphone, is just contaminating the hell out of the data. Next slide. And here, masking occurs when the threshold of detection of one sound source is raised by another. Go. True masking. Complete masking occurs in the inaudibility. I don't know that sound exists. Again. Next slide. Look at this. You have to have a difference of 20 dB. Important. We're not just dealing with 10, we're dealing with 20. Next slide. We should establish a background ambient, L90. And you can do that with an on-off test. Next slide. This is an on-off test. 8 times a second, turbine on. The shutdown occurs. Do the aerodynamic turbulences. You can see the sound level increases. And then it comes down. And then partway down around 35 dBA, you see that little spike. That's when the mechanical braking mechanism, as it's finally coming to a stop, kicks in. That's mechanical noise. And then there's the background. Those two spikes there, a person was shifting his feet on the ground. It's faux noise. It's not part of the data. Next slide. Proxy test is probably the best issue for Vermont, and that means we can go someplace else and get the background without having to shut a turbine down. Next slide. What about noise and health? This is why we're here. Next slide. This is the one that everyone wants to deny. Next slide. Look at that. 30 to 40 dBA. And then there's the 40 and the 40 to 55. There's no 45 advocated by who on this table. Next slide. We're dealing with 30 dBA to 40. Affects sleep, body movements, awakening, self-reported sleep disturbance, arousals from children, chronically ill and elderly. You are not protecting them if you go greater than 40. Next slide. And here's another set of health guidelines used in Europe. Next slide. Point out that they have done it for inside the house, EEG waking, 35 dBA. Motility, which means the fact that a sound is heard and the body moves. You respond, but you're not awakened. 32 dBA. And then the lower one, those are nighttime outdoor levels. 42 dB. Notice it says dB. It's linear. It's less. So if you see 42 dBA, I suspect that the sound level will actually be closer in dBA to 30. Because quite normally the difference in the average environment for natural sounds is about 8 to 10 dB. But you can see that those numbers indicate this is why we're having complaints. Next slide. Each slide ranking. Is there an easy way to show? Next slide. Go to level side. Dr. Ken Eldred. I miss that man so much. Next slide. Well, I took his recommendations, some others, and a colleague of mine, Robert Rand, and they're down the bottom, we came up with this. Next slide. Next slide. And included in there is Pedersen and Way, where they did studies on smaller turbines in Europe and were able to point out that the point at which the onset of complaints would occur was at above 32 dBA. Amazing when I took that curve and overlaid it onto the normalized EPA curve for a quiet area, it locked right on. I couldn't believe the correlation, how good it was. And then, well, what is ISO? ISO fits right in there. And Kemperman and James, two other acousticians, researchers, recommended 5 dB above background, 30 dB. Whoa, this is good data, and it's all, the only one that deals with wind turbines is Patterson and Way on that.
And you're on slide 51, just.
I'm going, go ahead.
And we're trying to.
No, I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
the slide you've been just talking about was 51.
Yeah,
correct?
no, just 52.
Okay.
Now, this is what Vermont has, and when you plot Vermont, you end up seeing that the community response, predicted community response would be strong appeals to stop the noise. 45. Well, you have reached that. You have that. And then the one above it is vigorous action. Next slide. This is where we're at. I had to add the red, and that is my interpretation. I know of 2 suicides and countless home abandonments. We have a real problem. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. This is, little mini-me is telling it. Wind began to influence professional organizations. And they came up with their own procedures, protocols, and methods, which basically threw out protecting public health. Next slide. Noise predictors use LEQs to hide worst case Lmax, which neighbors hear. Go. Imagine this presentation as a 10-minute straight red line. In other words, when really the intelligibility is in all those fluctuations. Go ahead. Noise recommendations? Next slide. Think about neighbors, what they hear. Compatibility. It's part of a Nancy standard. The fact that the adverse response can occur with a new noise source is not compatible. 15 dB. Trust independent noise studies that do not favor wind turbines, and go back to your Act 250. We're in court. It was proven. They decided. Lmax minus L90. Next slide. And I recommend here that you basically, Vermont is not a rural, is a rural environment. It's not an urban area. 45 dBA was the level determined or categorized sound levels in an urban area. And Ken Eldred basically said, beware for the quiet areas which we did not cover. Their response could be much greater. So my feeling is don't got all this pre-construction, just clearly define that at night we have sound levels less than 25 dBA. And then the predictions, Lmax 35, LEQ 32. Next slide. How about setbacks? Go ahead. These 2 European countries, Poland and Bavaria, 10 times the total height. Kind of a generic, but it's pretty representative. Cape Cod Commission kind of altered a bit, used the belay diameter. Next slide. Thank you for listening. I apologize for being so blunt, but
That's fine. Do we have questions? Yes.
I have a few. I'm happy to not ask them all. But could you go back to slide 59? I just had a quick question on slide 59. Is what you're saying, Mr. Ambrose, your position that Vermont Act 250 uses a limit of Lmax minus L90 less than
that was under the aesthetics, and I think you'd have to get the lawyer, I believe, who cited that best in a 4-page attachment that I submitted. That it came under the aesthetics versus the health part of Act 250.
Okay, in considering this, I would encourage the board to look into this. I'm pretty sure that this fact is incorrect. Act 250 does use an Lmax standard, but it is completely unrelated to the L90.
Well,
this
was in the court hearing.
Okay, we should check those facts. The other 2 questions would be that hypothetically, if an Lmax metric were used, what would you propose the limit to be, and what research would you show to protect against X impact that uses the LMAX metric? I noticed a lot of the standards that you show in your presentation do not actually use the LMAX metric. They use a different metric. So if you're to protect against X, say sleep disturbance or whatever it is, can you show me the research that uses LMAX?
The people respond to the maximum sound level. They do not respond to an LEQ.
Yeah, I agree that people can hear an LMAX. People
No,
can
they respond to the LMAX.
They can also hear an LMIN, but the research shows that people are affected by LEQs. And so it's not, LMAX isn't necessarily the only thing that people hear. During your presentation,
Back
you
up the
said
slides.
that
Back up
people
the
hear
slides.
LMAX, but they hear everything.
Okay, stop right here. Now, which sound level on there do you think they're going to respond to? Your L-min on the bottom or the L-max on the top?
I think people will respond to everything. It's all sound.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is. It is all sound. If you're not responding to the L-min is like the quietest time. That's a great time to relax, right? And L-max is potentially like, obtrusive to you. You respond to all of it. So saying some people respond to something doesn't mean anything.
Have you
Saying that
lived?
people hear something, back to my question was though, if you're proposing an LMAX limit, could you please cite the reference that says that LMAX at a certain level causes a specific impact?
It's a reaction. Do you, if I clap my hands, do you respond to the average over 10 minutes, or do you respond to the clap?
I would respond to both.
What would be my clap sound like average for 10 minutes? Wouldn't be heard. My clap is over in less than a second. I mean, go ahead.
I just have one other question, and then I'll sit down. I was wondering if you could speak to it, if you're proposing an LMAX limit, to how predictable LMAX is. A good part of a standard would be that it is a predictable metric. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that, and also how would you go about doing that?
Okay, here's the thing. I went through it very quickly. When I end up using the word L max, it is the loudest level. But when I'm talking about a noise source, it really is the repeating loudest level of that noise source. And if I have a repeating loudest level, I can quantify that with a L1% of the time, which would be very close to the L max, unless the L max was an impact and had a much greater crest factor, rise time on that. So it is just basically, I will change the L max to an L1. But even if I change it to an L10, which is used by the transportation industry, it is still going to be louder than the LEQ. And the problem is that we have devalued human hearing and human response by using LEQ. It is not appropriate.
Yeah, just so it's Chris Olson. Just so the board's aware, Mr. Ambrose and I do know each other. We don't agree on many things, but what I always enjoy is that we're always very respectful to one another. So this is all meant in respect. Mr. Ambrose, I mean, you do cite the World Health Organization, and then you go back to the LMAX discussion. I mean, you would acknowledge, wouldn't you, that the 40 decibel guideline, night noise guideline, is an L night, which actually is not only an average over one night, but an average over 365 days a year. So that 40 decibel L night metric that the WHO is not an L max.
No, I'm not talking back then. I'm not.
But if we go maybe back up
Back
one
up.
more.
Right there.
Yeah, right. That would be perfect. That would be great. So what I'm saying here is that these reported and 100% on board with the WHO on this, but these are on an L night, meaning 365 nights a year. If the guideline to be ideal to protect health would be under 40 decibels. Now, where we have to be careful and cautious when we're talking about the wind turbines, and this for the board, it's on page 11 to 13 that I spent quite a bit of time discussing these various metrics. But Mr. Ambrose, they include L maxes. They include nights where there's going to be very little noise. They include nights where there's going to be quite a bit more noise over 40 decibels. That is the average over the course of the year over all of the nights. So it's not equivalent to an L max, is it?
No, it says right up there, LAEQ night, outside.
Right. So that standard is not the same equivalent to a wind turbine
No, but
standard.
I'm saying
that
if you
we're
wanted to tie it to what Vermont had used previous, or had determined in a judicial hearing for LMAX,
But if
use-
you look at the literature from the World Health Organization,
Oh,
if
yeah.
you look at the other literature there, L maxes would be typically much, much higher than the levels that are here.
I defined that as LAEQ.
Right, but what I'm saying is that this isn't the equivalent to an L max discussion.
No, it isn't.
And that saying that, and I'm not suggesting you're misrepresenting, I just wanted to try to be clear here, that in addition to this, the World Health Organization says this would be a guideline of 40 decibels. The actual interim target in this document is 55. It's an L night noise is the definition, and yes,
You
to
are,
an
it
IQ.
is.
So what they're actually saying is they recognize that in most jurisdictions, you're not going to come anywhere close to 40.
And what did they,
And you're going to be 55 decibels, and that would be over the course of the year. So I think we just need to be careful as we're discussing, for wind turbines at 45 decibels as proposed by the Public Service Department, you're likely, and I think one of the other presenters showed, that you're likely on this equivalent metric going to be below 40 decibels L night.
go back, I want to get this
Sorry,
EPA slide. I guess it's the other way, it's down. It's the one where I show Vermont on a chart. Yeah, okay, keep going, right?
One more.
Right,
There it
one
is.
more. Okay. This one, this is LEQ.
Well, and I mean, I don't want to take up too much of the board's time, and I certainly don't want to get into a large argument with you here. I have, and on record, significant disagreement with how some of this is plotted and the like. I think what you just have to be cautious of, on both sides, both what I've told you as well as what Mr. Ambrose has told you, sift through everything, and that the annoyance was not complaints measured by Pedersen and Way. It was the reporting of annoyance, and that there certainly, as you go typically over the 40 decibel range, you start to see an increase in annoyance. But when you look at the health literature and the sleep literature, the question is that annoyance sufficient to then cause sleep disturbance and health impacts? When you look at the further research that's been done since the 2004 study, which was an excellent study, it was that first cautionary, hey, we might have an issue here. The recent work done is showing that we're not seeing that annoyance then linked through to the health impact.
Okay, now I'm going to end up, I wish I had done it. You pointed it out, and it's a great thing. What if I reverse the arrows? Have strong appeals to stop the noise to point in the other direction, and the arrow down 45.
But I'm not sure where does the strong appeals to stop the noise, where is that, where was the
The
study?
neighbors' complaints here.
So there, and I think I heard earlier that you have complaints out to 5 miles. You
I'm not
certainly,
doing that.
but I just want, let me play this out for a second. We certainly hear, and there, I've been open that there are areas where you do have complaints. You also have, for example, in the state of North Dakota, one of the highest installed wind capacities at 50 decibels as the sound limit. They've only had one registered complaint in the last decade, and it was resolved between the landowner and the developer. If you talk about potential health effects out to, and I'm not saying that you did, but your introducer did, out to 5 miles, out to 10 miles. I mean, we hear these things. There's nothing physically coming from a turbine at these further distances noise, ampersand, low-frequency noise that could be the result of that. So isn't it, and I think you said earlier, noise is an individual response.
Yeah,
And
we
it's
all
very
fall on a
compli-
bell curve.
And it's very complicated.
It's all
And
fall-
so,
It's, it's very statistical. Falls on a bell curve. And some of us are right in the middle, and there are a few on the perimeters. And those are the ones that we hear from. Yes.
I know,
I wanted to,
yeah, sure, go ahead.
hi, Sally Colopy again from Fairfield. Since you're talking about the WHO, my most recent submission to the panel that I ceded my time was, I just want to make sure that everyone is aware that 140 international scientists, physicians, acousticians, nurses, advocates, and academics have signed and forwarded a letter to the members of the panel of the WHO who are currently developing their new guidelines, urgently requesting, almost demanding, that they update their noise standards based on worldwide complaints. So I just want to make sure that that's very clear and everyone is aware that that's undergoing. And then the other thing that I'd like to say is regarding our project, SWAT and Win, is a question for Mr. Ambrose, is, so if you
Sorry,
have...
We can't talk about that specific project.
Well, okay, so let's say a typical project where the ambient sound levels have been recorded at 20 dBA at night, hypothetically, and proposed turbines, 7 500-foot proposed turbines are going to be 1,800 feet from a home. How is it possible, in your expertise, to get that sound level to remain at 45 dBA
Right, you're gonna,
when it has a 20 dBA ambient noise level
Well-
determined?
I didn't go, I kept my presentation short. My professional experience is that complaints start above 30 dBA. Probably 32 is very reasonable as the onset for complaints. And they get very, as sound levels go up, they get more dramatic on that. And I end up taking this perspective. I was taught an unwitnessed measurement is not a good measurement. All my measurements are witnessed, recorded on the instrument, observed, noted, that I heard that noise source, and it was all by itself. There was no contaminating sound. And when I go wading through all these documents that have been submitted with just data blizzards, I go, this is ridiculous. An expert is just printing out data, no analysis. And one of the ones that really got me mad was the one for WinTag in Massachusetts. That was put on by the Massachusetts DEP. I was a member of the WinTag team with Mass CEC. What is it? Can't remember CEC. They're the wind turbine promoters. And RSG submitted a report, hundreds of pages, tables of data, and he had some analysis in there, and it was all averaging, yet I could go through the table and just sort and go, ooh, that's an interesting little segment, and spot an exceedance. It was thrown out for some reason or just ignored totally. And I go, boards, commissions, reviewers should not have to go in and see if they can find this evidence. This evidence should be revealed by the expert to the reviewing body. And I never liked, basically, I design a project for a client, and then there's got to be a compliant test done. I tell the client I should not participate on it because I have a vested interest in compliance. And here in Vermont, it's just the opposite. The vested interest does the compliance test and doesn't witness them.
When you say witness it, you
mean
mean being
physically
physically
present.
present for 24 hours a
No,
day,
you don't.
3 weeks?
Don't need to do that. I co-authored
What do you mean by witness? Just,
Be There
For what period of time? Under what circumstances?
during the measurement.
Okay.
If you see my measurements up there, they're not tables of numbers. It's a plot. This is the important data that shows turbine on, turbine off. Very dramatic. And you can see what the ambient is and what the turbine is.
Mr. Ambrose?
Yes.
Excuse me, I'll speak up if I can. I don't have a microphone. I'm John Cotter. I'm a staff attorney at the board. I appreciate your suggestion about witness measurements, but there have been some people that have encouraged the board to require monitoring that takes place 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. What's your thinking on that in terms of witness measurements?
Well, we're here because of bad modeling. You haven't been given the right predictions. A conservative prediction for a wind turbine would be sound power level of the turbine, distance to the neighbor, inverse square law. Basically, it drops off at 60 dB per doubling the distance. So at 100 feet, you measured 60, 200 feet would be 54, and so on. 200 feet, then goes to 400 feet. Eventually, you get like 800 to 1600 feet, and you only get a 6 dB drop. The problem with wind turbines is it's an area source. So the worst place to observe a wind turbine is directly underneath the blades. You look up, it's like looking at a record on edge. You turn the record up there, it's a disc. This disc is the radiating surface. It's an area factor. And you have to go so many feet away based on the diameter and the height of the turbine before the sound starts to drop off. And it will first drop off at 3 dB and then 6 dB. And the low frequencies may never drop off at 6 dB, the very low frequencies, because their wavelengths are so long they follow a different rule pattern. And what people hear in the distance are the low frequencies. Now, we talk about, oh, we can't measure in the summer because of crickets, frogs. That's easy. I've been eliminating crickets and frogs from data for decades. I've been doing this for 40 years. Crickets and frogs occur above 1,000 hertz. There's a metric that's been proposed, I think it was by George Hessler, to basically calculate your dBA reading from frequencies up to 1,250 hertz. That excludes all crickets. It excludes most bird songs. And you find that when you get away from a wind turbine, that the predominant two frequencies are in the frequency bands are in the 250 and 500 hertz bands. They're almost signature for them. And you could basically tell how loud the turbine is by looking at those bands. Now, you measure in unweighted dB levels, but we can take those bands and weight them to an equivalent dBA level. But it's all been made so hard with these modelings. I mean, setback distance, that's easy, because it's basically the bigger the turbine, the louder it can be. The farther its sound propagation has to go before it converts into 6 dB per doubling. And that, I mean, it's just
So what about continuous monitoring?
continuous monitoring. I did the, went down to Falmouth. I went down to Falmouth, Massachusetts, to do the Bruce McPherson study with Robert Rand. And we waited 6 months to get the right weather conditions. We waited for a front to come through with the low pressure passing over Falmouth. That was the worst night I ever spent in a house. Infrasound. Interior of the house was 20 dBA. Outside the house was 42. Headache, nausea, and loss of cognitive ability. I could not calibrate my sound level meter until I went out and drove away to go to a location to do a measurement.
So what I take from that is that you would not be advocating for continuous monitoring. You do have to wait for the right conditions. And tell me if I'm wrong, if I interpreted that incorrectly.
I would end up basically, your applicant has to prove he's not going to exceed a sound level limit. Weather conditions do not make sound any louder. They make sound quieter. They affect the sound propagation. And what's happening here is we're using all kinds of, I don't want to say prediction techniques, but you can abuse a model by limiting the amount of proper adjustments that would be applicable if you were to do a truly conservative model. I must admit, when you end up using 10 degrees C and 70%, that is the right atmospheric conditions. But it's, when you have a noise model that's only effective, it says right in the model, the height of the source to the height of the receiver cannot be greater than 30 meters. It's about 110 feet. The distance out is 1,000 meters. This is where the model is accurate. If you're not inside those lines, and I view those lines as the breakdown lanes on either side of a road, if you go outboard of those lines, you're in the rough. The model is not accurate. It doesn't predict properly. George Hessler pointed out that at times, and with long-term monitoring, you can have exceedances of 15 to 20 dB during a measurement, just due to atmospheric conditions at that great distance. Because sound travels up, you get ducting, you get lensing, thermal conditions. You know, this ain't hard to do it conservatively. It's just, I am humbled by having to be here. I would have retired 5 years ago if it wasn't for wind turbines.
So you mentioned setbacks, and you've been talking,
Yeah.
sorry, soft spoken. There's been a lot of discussion during your presentation about decibels and sound measurements, but you've also mentioned setbacks.
Yes,
So
and
could you elaborate a little of your opinion, and especially as to whether, I hear perhaps an implication that setbacks would be a proxy for sound limit. Could you talk about that?
yes, it's sound degrades by distance. The farther away you get, the quieter it is. Excuse me, my eyes. It depends on the loudness of the noise source as to at what distance you get to 45, 40, 35 dBA. The height of the noise source gives you an idea of the electric power output it's capable of producing. The electric power output gives us the sound power level. So there's a relationship with the height of the turbine to the amount of sound power you can put out. So having a setback distance based on height would be appropriate. Is 10 dB, or excuse me, 10 times sufficient? Well, yeah, it does, but is it conservative? No. Would it protect public health? No. 15 dBB, 15 times might be more appropriate, but as I've seen in quiet environments in Australia and New Zealand, there were problems 20 times the diameter or the height of the turbine. And I'm coming at this from an observer's perspective. People are being impacted. We're not looking at a table of numbers and books that document all these journals that have been written by other people. Have you gone out and lived with a wind turbine? Have you gone out and lived with a noise source? That is part of my way of dealing with noise complaints. I need to understand the perspective of the neighbor's complaint. And it didn't take very long to find out that that chart is pretty damn accurate for quiet areas. It's been all normalized using the EPA methodology, but EPA normalizes for the sound source. I go, oh, that gets so complicated because people don't relate to the sound source. People live in an environment. So I ended up normalizing it in the reverse direction for the environment. So if you go back to that chart, what happens is this is for a quiet rural environment. If I was to apply this to a suburban environment, I'd shift that up 5 dB. And if I go to an urban environment, I'd shift it up 10 dB. So what this tells me, if you want to put a wind turbine, put it in an urban environment. You need much less distance.
And you're referring for the record to slide 53.
Yes, slide 53. And I'm saying the scale that changes is down here. If you go to a louder environment, this becomes 30, that becomes 40, all this. And it works, and this is what the EPA and Ken Eldred came up with back in the late 60s, early 70s. And remember, the 45 dBA originally was to classify urban environment or acoustic environments. And you find that it's urban environment, noisy urban environment, industrial environment, noisy industrial environment. They never went down to the quiet because back when the studies were done in the late 50s and 60s, 85% of the population lived in urban areas, so they were going to protect. The studies were focused on where the majority of the population lived.
Yes, Tom Nauer again.
Tom, good.
A couple of times you've mentioned the name George Hessler.
Yes.
And in the October 24th filing from VCE, page 7, there's reference to a 2011 report to the Maine PUC that was funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and was prepared by Hessler Associates.
It's two Hesslers. There's George Hessler and the son, David Hessler.
David, okay.
And I think David Hessler has been involved in Vermont more than George Hessler has. George is my contemporary. David is not. But George, he had a dramatic change when he saw that baby return to the house and start crying. He just, there's something to this. And it's not adequately pointed out in the letter. A colleague of mine, Rob Rand, was participant with that Shirley Wynn study, and he just pointed out it changed George. And this is people, when you look at people and you sit in their homes and you talk to them and you listen as they do, if I'm prone to motion sickness, so I say if you're prone to motion sickness, beware of infrasound. If you're not, boy, there's some nice homes out there to buy at 50% on the dollar.
Well, I appreciate you distinguishing between the two Hesslers.
Yes.
I had noticed the name David on the report that I reviewed.
Yeah.
So you had pointed to one statement or one conclusion in the report, in the October 24 filing. And I'm wondering whether you think the best practice guidelines overall are something that this board should look to for information, or whether you were really just focused on that one piece of information.
Well, it's just incremental information that just keeps saying we've got to be careful, because I ended up seeing a movie in the 50s. It's called Lifeboat, and it affected me when I was 14 years old, and there was an ocean liner sank, and there were 35 survivors, and they all swam to one lifeboat, and the lifeboat could only hold 30 people. And so people got in, and so 30 would be in, and 5 would be overboard, and they'd change them out. Eventually, after weeks, they had to sacrifice 5 people. And I ended up saying, as a noise control engineer, I'm never doing that. To say that I'm protecting all the citizens who live near a noise source that I'm involved with. It's not right to say, well, we got 95% protected. Well, I don't want to be that person hanging on to the outside of the lifeboat.
We've been referred to as collateral damage at times.
Yes, sir.
And I've known Steve for a long time, and I do appreciate his compassion and his technical abilities. I do want to make a few observations about some of the information that he's presented. We agree that modeling should be conservative, and I've gone through that. And we have demonstrated that the modeling protocol that we are proposing, by testing, it works. We know it doesn't fit in within the sidelines of the road as Steve described it, but we don't also not seen any evidence that shows that this modeling is not accurate. I don't think anything's been presented. The other few points is that the application of the LMAX, as Mr. Olson pointed out, he's applying this to all these technical references.
I did not. I'm
My
going to
turn.
correct that. You only see the LMAX when I referred to Act 250.
My turn.
Yeah, well, I want to correct
Okay,
myself.
you'll get a chance. But we're applying the LMAX in relation to World Health Organization guidelines, the ISO, the ANSI, and the EPA. All of those are long-term exposure guidelines. LMAX is not a suitable metric to compare. The APA standards and the adjustments in the normalized plots that's shown here. If you read the publications on that, these are all based on the researcher's intuition. None of this has been definitely proven by any measurements. All these reference documents are based on reactions to industrial and transportation noise sources. All these sources are independent of weather conditions. They're not necessarily relevant to wind turbines. The Supreme Court case that advocates use of the LMAX or condones it or accepts it, my understanding is that that's a Supreme Court case involving a pass-by of a large dump truck very near a residence. It doesn't seem like a very good case to base a wind turbine project on. It's very specific, pass-by of a large dump truck. So I really don't think it fits. As far as first-hand observations, I agree that if it's possible to do first-hand observations, you're going to learn a lot more about the sound. Unfortunately, with the measurement protocols that are required for wind turbines, it's really not practical. And what's more is that we now have the capability to record, measure sound data, audio data, very, very detailed information at numerous locations all at the same time for long periods. These can all be evaluated and verified by others. The problem with the first-hand observations, very limited time span, doesn't represent what's happening at different locations at different times. And the biggest problem was it cannot be verified by anyone else. So those are some of my reactions to what Mr. Ambrose is saying. I agree with his intent, and I admire his compassion, but some of this stuff is just not applicable and just not workable for what you're trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Blomberg?
Yeah. I'm right now looking at table 1 of the WHO document, the WHO Night Guidelines document. And it does use an LMAX metric for inside for a number of health indicators. It is not for all. I totally agree that some of these are a yearly average, some of them are not. But table 1 clearly shows, and do you have table 1 on yours too? I don't know if you have table 1, but table 1 clearly shows an LMAX metric
Go up one.
used.
Go down one, rather. No.
The other way.
Right there.
There.
LA max inside.
So there are clearly health effects that are correlated to the LMAX metric. There are some that are correlated to other metrics. That's not in dispute. But there are clearly ones with the LMAX metric.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we're trying to figure out what we want to do next. We still wanted to hear from Renewable Energy Vermont, and Paul Bruja was supposed to be here, but I don't see him here. Yes?
Paul Bruja is in Alabama with the family issue. I'm here.
So you were going to present in his stead?
Yes.
Okay. So, if you just give us a moment.
Continue the hearing.
Yep. Yep.
Can you stay longer? Yeah, so that's Friday night. Right. Yeah, so we're going to have to end this right now, and the hotel has another thing scheduled for this room. We just checked, because we wanted to know if we could stay later, and they said, no, we can't. So we'll schedule a follow-on and continuation of this, and we'll send you out a notice.
May I just say one closing thing?
Sure,
I am not adverse to continuous monitoring.
yeah. Not adverse to what?
Continuous monitoring. It's
Okay.
just that having a witness monitoring, it just means so much more. And recordings do not duplicate by oral hearing in the field. It's just one microphone listening, and you do not have a sense of direction.